Hey dreamers, tonight we're journeying to a place where time itself forgets how to move forward, where silver branches sing in languages that predate words, and where the veil between worlds grows so thin you could reach through and touch eternity. We're going to explore what the Celtic Otherworld was actually like, particularly the realm ruled by Manannán Mag Mell, the enigmatic son of the sea who governed paradise with the same casual ease most of us reserve for checking the mail. But what if this paradise came with a single heartbreaking rule that no mortal could ever escape? Why was the journey to this land of eternal youth so simple, yet the return journey almost always fatal? And what terrible secret about time itself makes this beautiful realm both a perfect haven and an inescapable prison? Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. It's always a pleasure to see our community of dreamers, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you now. The ancient Celts understood something that our modern world has largely forgotten, which is that reality isn't quite as solid as we pretend it is. They knew that beneath the familiar surface of hills and rivers, beyond the western horizon where the sun melts into the sea, there existed another world entirely. Not heaven, not quite hell, but something stranger and more beautiful than either, a place they called by many names. Tir na nog, the land of youth; Mag Mell, the plain of delights; Imain Ablach, the Isle of Apple Trees; Tir Tangaia, the land of promise. Each name was a doorway, a verbal map to a destination that existed everywhere and nowhere all at once. Imagine, if you will, standing on the western coast of Ireland as evening approaches. The light has that particular quality it gets just before sunset, golden and somehow thicker than usual, as though the air itself has turned to honey. The waves are rolling in with their eternal patience, each one carrying whispers from places you've never been but somehow remember. The wind tastes of salt and something else, something sweeter, like apples that have been blessed by hands that never knew mortality. You're not looking for anything in particular, just standing there, breathing, being. And then you see it, or maybe you don't see it so much as sense it. A shimmer on the horizon, a quality of light that doesn't quite belong to this world. For just a moment, the boundary between here and there becomes permeable, and you understand that you're standing at a threshold. This is how it often began in the old stories, with a chance encounter, a moment of receptivity, an accidental opening of the heart. The Celts knew that the otherworld wasn't locked away behind iron gates requiring ancient passwords. It was always there, pressing against the fabric of the ordinary world, waiting for someone to notice it. And when they did notice, when someone like you happened to be in the right place with the right eyes, the otherworld would reach out and extend an invitation that was impossible to refuse. But every offer from the otherworld, no matter how beautiful, carries a hidden price, one paid not in gold, but in the currency of time itself. To understand that price, however, you must first meet the god who sets the terms. The ruler of many of these otherworldly realms was a figure who embodied paradox with the nonchalance of someone who had transcended the need for consistency. Manannán Mag Mell, whose very name meant son of the sea, was a god who moved between worlds with the ease of water flowing through open fingers. He was a warrior, yes, but also a trickster, a guardian, a psychopomp, a merchant and a magician who could make the impossible look suspiciously easy. The stories describe him with white hair through which seaweed could be glimpsed, as if the ocean had claimed him from the inside out, and skin so translucent that the tides themselves seemed to flow beneath it. He was beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman, even as he walked among mortals wearing the face of an unremarkable traveller. Now, you might wonder why the ancient Irish would worship a god who had technically been defeated by their own ancestors, and honestly, it's a fair question that reveals just how much divine logic differs from the mortal variety. According to the mythology recorded in texts like the Lebor Gabala Eren, the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race to which Manannán belonged, were conquered by the Milesians, the mortal ancestors of the Irish people. It was a strange sort of conquest, though, more negotiation than annihilation, as though even victory recognized that some powers are too essential to simply eradicate. The Tuatha De Danann didn't vanish when they lost, they simply moved, slipping sideways into the hollow hills, the ancient burial mounds called Sídhe, where they continued to exist in a state that was neither fully absent nor entirely present. And it was Manannán who orchestrated this great retreat, who assigned each of his divine kindred to their own mound, who wrapped them all in the Faith Fiada, the mist of invisibility that kept them hidden from mortal eyes while allowing them to observe and occasionally meddle in human affairs. A practical solution, really, though one suspects that Manannán, who was nothing if not a strategic thinker, saw opportunities in defeat that others might have missed. After all, gods who dwell in fairy mounds can't be easily taxed, conquered, or held accountable for their actions, which, when you think about it, is a rather elegant form of divine project management. But Manannán's own home wasn't in the Sídhe mounds of Ireland. No, he claimed something grander and more remote, a series of islands that existed somewhere beyond the Western Sea, in that liminal space where water meets sky and both dissolve into something that is purely magical. These islands went by various names: Eman Ablach, Mag Mell, Tir na Nag, Tir Terngira, and while scholars have debated whether these were different places or simply different names for the same destination, the distinction probably didn't matter much to Manannán, who moved through space the way most people move through moods. The journey to Manannán's realm was itself a kind of initiation, a test of worthiness that sorted the merely curious from those who were meant to arrive. You couldn't simply decide to visit the otherworld and book passage on the next available boat. The realm chose you, or more accurately, Manannán chose you, often through one of his daughters or through some carefully orchestrated encounter that would seem like chance until you looked back on it later and realized how perfectly everything had been arranged. Take, for instance, the story of Oisín, the poet and warrior, son of the legendary Fionn mac Cumhaill. Oisín was out hunting with his father and the Fianna, the band of warriors who protected Ireland, when they encountered a woman riding toward them across the landscape. But this was no ordinary woman, and that was no ordinary horse. She sat astride a steed so white it seemed to have been carved from winter itself, a horse whose mane flowed like surf, whose eyes held the depths of the sea, whose hooves, when they struck the ground, rang out like silver bells. The woman herself was radiant, golden-haired, impossibly beautiful, dressed in garments that seemed to shift between colours that had no names in mortal languages. This was Niamh Chin Weir, Niamh of the golden hair, and she was one of Manannán's daughters, come from Tir na Nag with a very specific purpose. She rode directly to Oisín, which must have been somewhat awkward for everyone else present, and announced that she had fallen in love with him, that she had journeyed across the boundaries of worlds to find him, and that she was inviting him to return with her to the land of youth, where he would never grow old, never know sorrow, never experience anything but joy and love and endless beauty. It was the kind of offer that should have raised about 1,000 red flags, but there's something about being chosen by an otherworldly being that short-circuits all normal decision-making processes. Oisín looked into Niamh's eyes, which held oceans he'd never sailed and stars he'd never named, and agreed without hesitation. They rode together across the landscape and then onto the sea itself, because Niamh's horse, Enbar, was one of Manannán's magical steeds, a creature that could gallop across water as easily as across solid ground. And here's where the journey becomes truly strange, because as they rode, Ireland began to recede behind them, growing smaller and dimmer, as though it were being painted in increasingly pale watercolours, while ahead of them, emerging from mist and distance, another land appeared. It came into view gradually, the way dreams assemble themselves around you when you're just at the edge of sleep, first as suggestions of colour and form, then as something more solid, more real, until finally they were riding onto a shore of white sand that sang beneath the horses' hooves. And what Oisín saw when he dismounted on the shore of Tir na Nag would have broken something in him if he tried to hold it all at once. It was too much, too beautiful, too impossibly perfect, and the only way to survive the experience was to let it wash over him in waves, to accept each wonder as it presented itself without trying to catalogue or understand or compare it to anything he'd known before. The light was the first thing. It had a quality unlike any light in the mortal world, somehow both softer and more brilliant, as though every photon had been polished to perfection before being released into the air. It didn't have a single source. The sun that hung in the sky above Tir Na Na seemed to shine from everywhere and nowhere, illuminating without casting harsh shadows, warming without burning. Everything it touched looked more vividly itself, the colours more saturated, the edges more defined, as though reality here had been turned up to a setting that mortal eyes weren't quite designed to process. The landscape itself seemed to have been designed by someone who had studied earthly beauty and then decided to improve upon it in ways both subtle and profound. There were rolling hills covered in grass so green it looked like liquid emerald, dotted with flowers that bloomed in shades that didn't quite exist in the mortal spectrum. Trees grew in perfect proportions, their branches laden with fruit that gleamed like jewels, apples of gold and silver, plums the colour of midnight, pears that glowed with their own inner light. And the air, oh, the air was something else entirely, carrying scents that shifted and layered upon one another, now honeysuckle, now fresh rain, now something indefinable that made you think of home even though you'd never smelled it before in your life. Water ran everywhere in Tir Na Nag, but this was water that seemed more conscious than its earthly counterpart, streams that sang as they flowed, fountains that created harmonies when their droplets fell into waiting pools, lakes so clear you could see straight through to the bottom even when they were fathoms deep. And in these waters swam fish unlike any in mortal seas, salmon that cracked hazelnuts in their jaws and embodied all the wisdom of the world, creatures whose scales reflected the colors of dreams, beings that swam between substance and spirit with easy grace. Buildings rose from the landscape, though whether they were constructed or grown or simply willed into existence was impossible to say. Palaces of white silver with roofs thatched from the wings of white birds, a detail that sounds absurd until you see it and realize that in this place, absurdity and beauty are the same thing. Walls of bronze that gleamed even in shadow, towers that caught the wind and turned it into music, doorways that opened onto rooms that seemed larger on the inside than the buildings that contained them. And everywhere there was art, intricate knotwork that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond comprehension, sculptures that moved when you weren't looking directly at them, murals that told stories that changed depending on who was reading them. Honestly, which aspect of an otherworldly realm do you think would be most difficult to leave behind? For me, it has to be the way time works differently there, the idea that you could spend what feels like years exploring and learning and being, and have it all exist in a single, perfect present. Though I suppose Oisín would eventually have a very different opinion on that particular feature. The inhabitants of Tir Na Na were as varied and wondrous as the landscape itself. The Tuatha De Danann dwelt here in their full glory, undimmed by proximity to mortal disbelief, gods and goddesses who shone with the power of their particular domains. There were craftsmen whose skill bordered on the miraculous, smiths who could forge swords that never dulled, poets whose verses could reshape reality, musicians whose playing could heal any wound or inflict any emotion. The people who walked these lands were uniformly beautiful, but it was a strange, uncanny beauty, all pale skin and bright eyes and features just slightly too perfect to be entirely human. Their hair ranged from white to black with every impossible colour in between, gold and copper, and shades of blue and green that suggested they might have been born from the sea itself. They wore garments that seemed woven from light and shadow and precious metals beaten so thin they moved like silk. Silver cloaks fastened with golden brooches, purple mantles bordered with threads of platinum, tunics that shifted from one colour to another as the wearer moved. They adorned themselves with jewellery that served purposes beyond mere decoration, torques that granted protection, rings that enhanced particular abilities, bracelets that connected the wearer to specific streams of power or knowledge. Every item had a story, a history, a weight of meaning that transcended its material value. and they engaged in activities that would seem familiar to any mortal, but elevated, perfected, made eternal. There was feasting, oh, the feasting, tables that stretched to the horizon laden with foods that satisfied not just hunger but desires you didn't know you possessed. The bread tasted like every warm memory of home, the meat like the satisfaction of a hard day's work completed, the fruit like the first kiss of summer. Goblets filled with mead that granted not just intoxication but actual altered states of consciousness, wines that could make you forget any sorrow or remember any joy you'd ever experienced. And at the centre of many of these feasts was a particular portion of pork, one of Manannán's magical swine that could be slaughtered and eaten and would be whole again by the next morning, an inexhaustible supply of sustenance that probably says something profound about the nature of abundance in a realm where scarcity is literally impossible. The music in Tír na nG deserves its own description because it wasn't simply beautiful, it was transformative, functional, a force that could alter reality with the same casual ease that mortal music might alter a mood. When the harpers played their instruments crafted from materials that didn't exist in the mortal world, strung with threads of silver and gold, the melodies that emerged could heal the sick, cause the healthy to sleep for days, make warriors put down their weapons, or drive them to feats of impossible valor. The music was more than sound. It was magic in its purest form, vibration arranged with such precision that it could rewrite the rules that governed existence. There were games too, though the games played in the Otherworld had stakes and meanings that went far beyond simple entertainment. Fidchel, an ancient board game that might have been the ancestor of chess, was played with pieces carved from precious materials, and the outcomes of these games could determine fates, settle disputes, or reveal truths that were hidden by more conventional means of inquiry. Racing and hunting and contests of strength and skill occurred regularly, and the winners received prizes that were themselves magical, items of power, favour from the gods, knowledge that couldn't be obtained any other way. And through all of this moved Manannán himself, sometimes in his own form, sometimes disguised as a merchant or a warrior or a beggar or a fool, because the Lord of the Otherworld was nothing if not a master of transformation and misdirection. He had inherited or created or been gifted with a collection of magical possessions that would be the envy of any deity in any pantheon, each item a wonder in itself, each contributing to his power and prestige in ways both practical and symbolic. There was his boat, Squaba Twine, the wave sweeper, a vessel that needed no crew, no oars, no sails, because it navigated itself according to the will of whoever commanded it. You could tell it where you wanted to go, even if that destination existed in another world or another time, and the wave sweeper would take you there by the shortest route, which might look nothing like a straight line to anyone watching from outside. The boat was crafted from materials that seemed to shift between wood and metal and something that might have been solidified moonlight, and it moved across water with a speed that defied all laws of physics that mortals had managed to discover. His horse, Aonbar, sometimes called Enbar of the Flowing Mane, was a steed that made every other horse look like a rough draft. White as foam, swift as thought, this creature could gallop across land or sea with equal ease, and any rider mounted on Aonbar could not be wounded, could not be unhorsed, could not fail to reach their destination no matter what obstacles stood in their way. The horse's mane really did seem to flow like water, each strand moving independently as though caught in a wind that only it could feel, and its eyes held an intelligence that suggested it was far more than a simple animal, possibly a spirit in equine form, possibly something for which there isn't even a proper category. Manannán carried a sword named Fragarak, which translates to the answerer or the retaliator, and the name itself should give you some idea of the weapon's nature. This was a blade that could cut through any armour as though it were morning mist, that delivered wounds which were always fatal, that reduced its opponents to the weakness of a woman in childbirth, which is, when you think about it, a rather specific and somewhat disturbing image that tells you exactly how the ancient Irish felt about both combat and reproduction. But Fragarak had another property that was perhaps even more fearsome. When pointed at someone's throat, that person became incapable of lying, compelled to speak only truth, which is the kind of ability that could end friendships, topple governments, and generally make you extremely unpopular at parties. He owned a cloak of invisibility, though calling it simply a cloak undersells its capabilities significantly. This garment, when wrapped around himself or others, didn't just make its wearer invisible, it created a shroud of forgetting, a magical amnesia that affected everyone who might have seen or remembered the person. Shake the cloak between two lovers and they would forget they'd ever met, their entire relationship erased as though it had never existed. It was this cloak, or one very much like it, that Manannán used to conceal the Sídhe mounds of the Tuatha De Danann, wrapping an entire divine race in protective forgetfulness so that mortals would walk past their dwelling places without ever noticing the impossibilities that lay just beneath the surface of ordinary hillsides. There was a helmet that either was called Cathbar or wasn't called anything in particular depending on which scholar you consult, set with precious gems that probably did something more than just look pretty, though the sources are frustratingly vague on the details. Body armor that made the wearer invulnerable, or at least significantly less vulnerable, which is all you can really ask from armor, divine or otherwise. A crane bag, which sounds ridiculous until you learn that it was crafted from the skin of a woman who had been transformed into a crane and lived for 200 years before dying, after which Manannán made her skin into a bag that could contain all the treasures of Ireland but would appear empty at low tide and full only when the tide was high, which is the sort of metaphor that would give a poetry professor conniptions of joy. And perhaps most remarkable, most essential to the functioning of his realm, Manannán possessed pigs. Magical pigs, yes, but still pigs, which is a reminder that even in paradise, practicality matters. These swine could be slaughtered and eaten and would be whole again by the next day, providing an eternal supply of food for the inhabitants of the otherworld. They were smaller and fiercer than modern domestic pigs because this was the Iron Age and everything was smaller and fiercer back then, and they represented not just sustenance but a kind of sacredness, a connection to the cycle of death and rebirth that was never quite as permanent in the otherworld as it was in the mortal realm. But beyond all these magical possessions, beyond all the powers and titles and responsibilities, what truly defined Manannán was his role as a guardian of thresholds, a keeper of boundaries, a god who existed in the spaces between definite categories. He was of the sea, but not limited to it, a warrior who rarely fought, a king who ruled without apparent effort, a trickster who used his tricks for purposes that weren't always clear until long after the punchline had landed. He moved between worlds with an ease that suggested the boundaries that seemed so solid to everyone else were, from his perspective, more like suggestions than walls. And he had a particular fondness for certain mortals, those rare individuals who caught his attention through some combination of bravery, stupidity, talent, or simple bad luck. When Manannán decided to interact with a human, he did so on his own terms, which meant that the human in question was usually in for an experience that would either elevate them to legendary status or destroy them completely, with very little middle ground between those outcomes. Consider the story of King Cormac Mac Air, one of Ireland's high kings, a man who by all accounts was a capable ruler trying to manage the impossible task of keeping Iron Age Ireland from descending into even more chaos than usual. Cormac had the misfortune, or fortune depending on how you look at it, to catch Manannán's attention, and the sea god decided to extend an invitation in his typically indirect fashion. Manannán appeared at Cormac's fortress at Tara, disguised as a warrior, unremarkable enough that guards let him pass without excessive scrutiny. He carried with him a silver branch from which hung 3 golden apples, and when he shook this branch, it produced music unlike anything Cormac or his court had ever heard. The melodies were so beautiful, so perfectly crafted to soothe every possible source of pain or worry or fear, that they could heal the sick, calm the angry, and induce a sleep so deep and peaceful that those who experienced it would wake feeling as though they'd been reborn. Cormac, who was nothing if not acquisitive when it came to magical objects, wanted that branch with the kind of desire that overrides common sense and basic self-preservation. Manannán, playing his role to perfection, offered to give Cormac the branch in exchange for 3 gifts, the exact nature of which would be specified later. And Cormac, demonstrating the kind of judgment that probably explains why being a high king in ancient Ireland was such a short-lived occupation, agreed to these terms without negotiating for any details whatsoever. Over the course of the following year, Manannán returned 3 times to collect his payment, and each time he took one of Cormac's family members, his daughter, his son, his wife, walking away with them while Cormac stood by, bound by his word, watching his family disappear with this stranger. Each time Cormac's grief was so overwhelming that it threatened to break him entirely, and each time he remembered the silver branch, shook it, and let its music wash away his sorrow in a way that should have been disturbing, but instead just felt like relief. When all 3 payments had been collected, when Cormac was alone in his fortress with nothing but a magical branch for company, a thick mist descended on Tara. And when it lifted, Cormac was no longer in Ireland at all. He was standing on a vast green plain, looking at a fortress surrounded by a wall of bronze that gleamed in a light that came from everywhere and nowhere. Inside that fortress was a house crafted from white silver and thatched with wings of white birds, because apparently that's just what you do when you're a sea god with unlimited resources and a flair for the dramatic. In the courtyard of this impossible house, Cormac found a fountain unlike any he had seen before. It was made of materials that seemed to shift between stone and crystal, and from it flowed 5 streams of water so pure and clear that looking at them was like looking at the concept of water itself, undiluted by any earthly impurities. 9 hazel trees grew around this fountain, and as Cormac watched, he saw them drop their nuts into the water below. 5 salmon swam in that fountain, salmon that were clearly far more than simple fish, and these salmon cracked the hazelnuts open with their teeth, allowing the shells to flow away down the streams while they consumed the wisdom contained within. The sound of the water as it fell and flowed was described as being more melodious than any music created by human hands, and standing there listening to it, Cormac understood that he was witnessing something fundamental, a source of knowledge itself, the place from which all understanding ultimately flowed. The 5 streams, Manannán would later explain, represented the 5 senses through which knowledge enters human consciousness, and the salmon were the wisdom that could be obtained by properly combining sensory experience with the kernels of truth that fell from the trees of understanding. It was all extremely metaphorical in a way that ancient druids probably found deeply satisfying and everyone else found vaguely exhausting. A warrior appeared then, striking and strange, and led Cormac on a tour of this realm, showing him wonders that the king barely had the vocabulary to describe even to himself. And at the end of this tour the warrior revealed himself to be Manannán mac Lir, and he explained that he had brought Cormac to the Otherworld specifically to show him this place, to let him see the land of promise with his own eyes, to give him an experience that would mark him forever as someone who had crossed that threshold between the ordinary and the impossible. Manannán also returned Cormac's family to him because the whole abduction thing had been a test, a way of determining whether Cormac could endure loss, maintain his word, and still remain capable of wonder. The family had been perfectly safe the entire time, dwelling in some other part of the Otherworld, probably having a much better time than Cormac had been having with his magical branch and his increasing loneliness. And Manannán gave Cormac additional gifts, a golden goblet that would shatter if 3 lies were told over it, but remain whole when 3 truths were spoken, which seems like it would make dinner parties either very honest or very quiet. Also probably the silver branch, though the accounts differ on whether Cormac got to keep it or had to return it once he went back to Ireland. Because of course Cormac did go back. That's one of the key features of these otherworld journeys, they almost always end with a return, though what returns is never quite the same as what left. The mortal who visits the land of promise comes back marked by the experience, carrying memories of perfection that make the ordinary world seem diminished by comparison, wrestling with the knowledge that there are realms of existence that operate by entirely different rules, trying to integrate an understanding of the impossible into a life that stubbornly insists on remaining mundane. For Oisín, the poet who had ridden across the sea with Niamh of the golden hair, the return would prove far more devastating than anything Cormac experienced. But before we get to that particular tragedy, we should spend more time in the realm itself, because the nature of time in Tir na Nog is essential to understanding what made it both paradise and trap. In the mortal world, time is a river that flows in only one direction, carrying everything along with it toward inevitable dissolution and death. You are born, you age, you die, and there's no negotiating with this sequence, no amount of wishful thinking or magical intervention that can fundamentally alter the trajectory. But in Tir na Nog, time worked differently, so differently that calling it time at all might be misleading. It was more like an eternal present, a continuous now in which nothing decayed, nothing aged, nothing moved toward any kind of ending. The inhabitants of this realm were eternally young, eternally beautiful, eternally healthy, locked into a state of perfection that never wavered or faded. There was no sickness here, no old age, no death from natural causes. Wounds healed almost instantly if they occurred at all. Illnesses were unknown. The slow degradation that characterizes mortal existence simply did not happen. And for someone coming from a world where everything eventually falls apart, where aging is inevitable and death is guaranteed, this must have seemed like the ultimate liberation, freedom from the tyranny of linear time. But here's the thing about living in an eternal present. It means that change itself becomes impossible, or at least extremely difficult. If time isn't pushing you forward, if there's no pressure to grow or evolve or become something other than what you currently are, then existence can start to feel less like paradise and more like a beautiful prison. Days blend into each other because there's no framework for distinguishing between them. Every moment is perfect, which means no moment is special, and the very concept of narrative, of having a story with a beginning, middle, and end, becomes increasingly alien. For Oisín, living in Tir na Nog with Niamh was everything he could have wanted, at least initially. They married, they loved each other, they had children, sons, and a daughter who grew up in this timeless paradise, which raises interesting questions about how growth and development work in a place where time supposedly doesn't pass. But the myths don't worry too much about those kinds of logical contradictions. They feasted, they hunted, they engaged in all the pleasures that Tir na Nog offered, and for what seemed to Oisín like 3 years, he was completely, perfectly happy. But underneath that happiness, beneath the surface of contentment, something was growing, a small seed of homesickness that he couldn't quite name or address. He started thinking about Ireland, about his father Fionn and the rest of the Fianna, about the hills he'd grown up in and the songs he'd sung there, about a life that had been bounded by mortality and all the more precious because of those boundaries. The perfect beauty of Tir na Nog started to feel less like freedom and more like a gilded cage, and the very immortality that had once seemed like the ultimate gift began to feel like a burden. Niamh could sense this change in him, because when you love someone in a realm where emotion is magnified and clarified by the absence of temporal constraints, you become exquisitely attuned to every shift in their inner landscape. She knew what he was feeling, and she knew, with the terrible knowledge that comes from being a child of the otherworld, exactly how this story would end. But she loved him too much to keep him prisoner, even if that imprisonment was in paradise, so she agreed to let him return to Ireland. She gave him very specific instructions, very clear warnings, because she understood the mechanics of crossing between worlds far better than any mortal could. He was to ride Enbar back across the sea. The magical horse would carry him safely to Ireland, but under no circumstances was he to dismount, under no circumstances was his foot to touch Irish soil. As long as he remained mounted on the otherworldly steed, he would remain connected to Tir na Nog, protected by its magic, immune to the effects of mortal time. But the moment he touched the earth of Ireland, those 3 years he'd spent in the otherworld would catch up with him all at once, and he would experience every moment of time that had actually passed in the mortal realm while he'd been away. Because here's what Oisín didn't know, what no one who visits the otherworld ever seems to adequately prepare for. Time in Tir na Nog doesn't just move differently, it moves at a completely different rate. A year in the land of youth might be a century in Ireland, 3 years might be 300, and there's no reliable conversion rate, no formula you can use to calculate how much time has passed in one realm versus the other. The disconnect is part of the magic, part of what makes the otherworld other. Oisín mounted Enbar and rode back across the sea, across water that had once seemed like a barrier but now felt like a bridge connecting two halves of his existence. As he rode, Ireland came into view, but it looked different from how he remembered it. The mountains were the same shape, the coastline followed familiar curves, but something about the quality of the land had changed in ways he couldn't quite identify. It looked smaller somehow. Or maybe he had grown larger, or perhaps it was just that once you've seen a land that exists outside of time, every place that's subject to temporal decay looks diminished by comparison. He rode inland, searching for familiar landmarks, for the hill of Allen where his father's fortress had stood, for some sign of the Fianna and the world he'd left behind. But everywhere he looked, everything was wrong. The fortress was gone, not ruined, but simply absent, as though it had never existed at all. The forests had been cut down or had grown wild in patterns that suggested centuries of unchecked growth. The people he saw were dressed differently, spoke with accents he didn't recognize, lived in dwellings that bore no resemblance to the Ireland he remembered. And then he came across a group of men trying to move a large stone, struggling with it, failing, their faces red with exertion and frustration. It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary problem, and Oisín, who was still technically a warrior of the Fianna, still possessed of all his otherworldly enhanced strength, instinctively leaned down from his horse to help them. He was going to use his strength to lift the stone, going to solve this problem with the casual ease that comes from spending 3 years in a realm where the laws of physics are more like polite suggestions. But as he leaned down, the girth of his saddle, stressed by the angle and the shift in weight, snapped, and Oisín, still reaching for the stone, lost his balance and fell. For a moment he was suspended in air, caught between the otherworldly horse and the mortal ground, belonging fully to neither realm. And then his foot touched the earth of Ireland, and 300 years caught up with him in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His body, which had remained young and strong and perfect in Tir na Nog, suddenly remembered every year. It hadn't aged, every moment of time it had skipped, and it aged 3 centuries in a matter of seconds. His hair went from brown to white, his smooth skin turned to parchment and then to something even more fragile. His straight back bent, his clear eyes clouded, his strong muscles withered, and he fell the rest of the way to the ground as an old man, the oldest man any of those Irish farmers had ever seen. Enbar, the magical horse, didn't stay to watch this transformation. The moment Oisín fell, the moment he ceased to be a passenger from the otherworld and became simply another mortal subject to mortal time, the horse turned and galloped back toward the sea, back to Tir na Nog, where Niamh was presumably waiting, presumably grieving, presumably unsurprised because she had known, had tried to warn him, had understood that this was how it would end. Oisín lay on the Irish ground, ancient beyond belief, too weak to stand, too transformed to fully comprehend what had just happened to him. The men who had been moving the stone gathered around him, frightened by this impossible old man who had appeared from nowhere, asking him questions he could barely understand because even the language had changed in 300 years. And according to some versions of the story, it was St. Patrick himself who found Oisín there, St. Sídhe. Patrick, who was travelling through Ireland converting pagans to Christianity, St. Patrick who sat with this ancient warrior and listened to his tales of the Fianna and Tir na Nog and the old gods before they retreated into the hollow hills. The later Christian scribes who recorded these stories couldn't resist adding dialogue between Oisín and Patrick, having the pagan warrior stubbornly defend the old ways while the saint attempted to convert him, creating a literary device that allowed them to preserve pagan mythology while simultaneously condemning it. Oisín, in these accounts, dies shortly after telling his story, his death explicitly framed as the final end of the pagan world, the last warrior of the Fianna passing from existence at the same moment that Christianity firmly establishes itself in Ireland. It's all very symbolic and more than a little heavy-handed, but it does capture something true about the nature of cultural transition, the way old stories persist, even as new frameworks attempt to replace them. But let's return to the realm itself, because Oisín's tragedy, as heartbreaking as it is, shouldn't overshadow the larger truth about what the Celtic Otherworld represented in the imagination and cosmology of the ancient Irish. This wasn't just a nice place to visit, it was a fundamental component of their understanding of reality, a necessary counterpoint to the mortal world, a place where the rules that governed ordinary existence could be temporarily suspended or inverted or ignored entirely. The Otherworld was accessible through specific portals at specific times, though the boundaries were always somewhat permeable, always potentially crossable for those who had the right kind of eyes or the right kind of luck. The ancient burial mounds, the Sídhe, were the most reliable doorways because these were places where the dead had been laid to rest, where the boundary between life and death was already thin, already transgressed on a regular basis. If you knew the right time to approach one of these mounds, if you were bold enough or drunk enough or desperate enough, you might find a door that hadn't been there a moment before, an opening that led down into a realm that was impossibly vast compared to the modest size of the hill that contained it. Lakes and rivers and the sea itself were also portals, because water in Celtic belief was never simply H2O, it was a symbol of the boundary between worlds, a medium through which transformation occurred. Diving into the depths of a sacred pool might take you into the otherworld, or simply drown you, and the only way to find out which was to take the plunge and hope for the best, which is not a strategy that prioritizes personal safety but does make for exciting stories. Certain times of year were more conducive to crossing between worlds than others. Samhain, the festival that marked the beginning of winter and the end of the harvest season, was the most liminal of all, a night when the boundaries between the mortal realm and the otherworld grew so thin they were practically transparent. On Samhain, the Sídhe mounds would open, the spirits of the dead and the gods would walk freely among mortals, and anyone foolish enough to be out wandering alone might find themselves accidentally crossing into the other realm without quite meaning to. Beltane, the spring festival celebrating the beginning of summer, was another thin time, another moment when the rules governing separation between worlds relaxed their grip. Midsummer held its own particular magic, and even ordinary dusk and dawn were considered liminal times, threshold moments when neither day nor night held full dominion and anything might slip through the cracks between one state and another. But beyond the physical portals and the calendrical gateways, there was another way to reach the other world, and that was through invitation, through being chosen by one of its inhabitants for reasons that were rarely explained and not always benevolent. The beautiful otherworldly woman appearing with a silver apple branch, the mysterious warrior extending an invitation to feast in his hall, the strange horse that appeared just when someone needed transportation, these were all potential doorways, potential offers that could lead to paradise or disaster, depending on circumstances that the mortal involved usually couldn't control. And this uncertainty, this sense that crossing into the other world was always a gamble, always potentially dangerous even when it promised beauty and joy, was essential to how the ancient Celts understood the relationship between their world and the realm of the gods. The other world wasn't heaven, it wasn't a reward for good behavior or a destination earned through piety. It was other, alien, operating by logic that didn't quite map onto mortal understanding, offering gifts that came with prices that weren't always obvious until it was too late to refuse them. The gods who dwelt there, The Tuatha De Danann, in all their terrible beauty, weren't benevolent parental figures watching over humanity with unconditional love. They were powerful beings with their own agendas, their own conflicts, their own complex relationships with mortals that involved fascination and disdain and desire and boredom in measures that shifted depending on their mood and the situation. They could be generous, yes, offering gifts of knowledge or power or magical objects, but they could also be capricious, cruel, or simply indifferent to mortal suffering in a way that came from existing outside the framework that makes suffering comprehensible. Manannán himself embodied this divine inscrutability perfectly. In some stories, he was a helper, a patron, someone who enabled heroes to achieve their destinies by lending them magical horses and weapons and wisdom. In other tales, he was a trickster, someone whose interventions created more problems than they solved, who seemed to delight in watching mortals struggle with the consequences of divine attention. And sometimes he was both simultaneously helping and hindering in the same gesture, because operating on a divine scale means that human categories like good and bad become inadequate for describing your actions. The fact that Manannán was defeated by mortal ancestors, that the Tuatha De Danann as a whole were conquered by the Milesians, suggests something interesting about the Irish understanding of divine power. These weren't omnipotent gods of the Judeo-Christian variety, beings who existed wholly outside the mortal sphere and could reshape reality with a thought. They were powerful, yes, but not invincible, capable of being defeated, capable of choosing retreat over annihilation, capable of making bargains with mortals that suggested a level of pragmatism rarely associated with deities. And yet, even in defeat, even in retreat, they retained their power and their allure. The Sídhe mounds where they dwelt after giving up Ireland became places of power and mystery, locations that wise people avoided lest they attract the attention of beings who existed just slightly adjacent to mortal reality. The festivals where the boundaries thinned were approached with a mixture of excitement and terror, because contact with the otherworld might bring blessings or curses depending on factors that seemed utterly random to anyone on the mortal side of the equation. The feasts held in Manannán's halls, the legendary gatherings where the Tuatha De Danann and favoured mortals would come together to eat and drink and celebrate existence itself, were particular manifestations of this power. The Feast of Goidniu, named after the divine smith who was one of the Trí De Dana, the three gods of skill, served a special ale that conferred immortality on those who drank it, or at least a kind of timelessness that functioned similarly. Eat the food of the otherworld, drink its mead, partake in its abundance, and you became connected to that realm in ways that transcended simple physical presence. You took something of the otherworld into yourself, and that connection persisted even after you returned to mortal lands. Which raises the question, what do you think would be the hardest part of returning to the ordinary world after experiencing the otherworld? For me, it would probably be the way ordinary beauty would feel inadequate after seeing perfection, the way normal food would taste bland after feasting on dishes that satisfied not just your body but your soul. The knowledge that you'd experience something extraordinary and would never be able to fully communicate what it was like to anyone who hadn't been there, that seems like it would be its own kind of isolation. The inhabitants of Tir na Nog and the other otherworld realms lived in a state that the ancient Irish clearly found aspirational, a life without suffering, without loss, without the steady grinding decay that characterized mortal existence. But the stories also suggest an ambivalence about this paradise, a recognition that a life without endings might also be a life without meaning, that the very things that made mortal existence difficult, scarcity and aging and death, were also the things that gave it shape and significance. Oisín's decision to return to Ireland, even after 3 years in paradise, with a woman who loved him and children who would never grow old or know sorrow, suggests that something essential was missing from life in Tir na Nog, some quality that the otherworld, for all its perfections, couldn't provide. Maybe it was the simple fact of change, the knowledge that each moment is unique and unrepeatable because time is carrying you forward whether you want to go or not. Maybe it was the connections to place and people and history that transcended romantic love and family ties, the web of relationships that defined identity in Iron Age Irish culture. Maybe it was just homesickness, that ache for a specific landscape and a specific set of circumstances that no amount of objective beauty can satisfy. The tragedy of Oisín's fall isn't just that he aged 300 years in an instant, it's that he lost access to the other world at the same moment he lost his youth, his strength, his vitality. He couldn't return to Niamh, couldn't see his children again, couldn't take back the choice he'd made when he leaned down to help strangers move a stone, demonstrating the kind of selfless heroism that had defined the Fianna in their prime. He was trapped in Ireland, in a time that wasn't his own, among people who remembered his father and the Fianna only as ancient legends, living out his final days as a living relic of a past that had been gone for 3 centuries. And Niamh was trapped in Tir na Nog, eternally young, eternally beautiful, eternally grieving for a love that had ended the moment Oisín's foot touched Irish soil. Because that's another thing about the other world, the emotions experienced there were just as eternal as everything else, undiminished by time, unchanging, forever preserved in the state they held at the moment of their creation. Her grief wouldn't fade, wouldn't be softened by the passage of years, wouldn't be replaced by acceptance or new love or any of the coping mechanisms that mortals develop to survive loss. It would simply persist, perfect and terrible forever. The silver branch that Manannán gave to various mortals, to King Cormac, to the hero Bran MacFeeble, to others whose stories had been lost or forgotten, served as both invitation and symbol, a tangible piece of the otherworld that could exist in the mortal realm, creating beauty and healing and sleep wherever it went, but also serving as a constant reminder of what existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. The apples that hung from that branch, golden or crystalline depending on which version of the story you believe, never diminished when eaten, never rotted, never lost their sweetness or their power to sustain. The symbolism here is almost painfully obvious. Apples as the fruit of knowledge or immortality, branches as representations of the world, tree connecting earth to heaven, silver as the metal of the moon and of purity and of the mystical feminine. The ancient Celtic poets and storytellers weren't subtle about their metaphors, and they didn't need to be, because everyone in their audience understood the symbolic language they were speaking, recognized the archetypal patterns being invoked, knew that when a beautiful woman appeared with a silver branch, you were about to hear a story that would teach you something essential about the relationship between mortal and divine. The otherworld, in all its manifestations, in all the names it was given, and all the forms it took in different stories, represented something that the ancient Celts valued so deeply they built their entire religious and mythological system around it. It was the source of power, the wellspring of magic, the place where the gods dwelt and from which all blessings flowed. But it was also a warning, a reminder that some things were not meant for mortal comprehension, that there were boundaries for good reason, that not all invitations should be accepted even when they promise everything you've ever wanted. Manannán mac Lir, in his role as guardian and psychopomp, as the figure who controlled access to the otherworld and determined who could enter and who must remain outside, embodied the fundamental ambiguity at the heart of this relationship. He wasn't a gatekeeper in the sense of keeping people out, he was more like a customs agent, examining each potential visitor, determining what they were capable of handling, what they were worthy of receiving, what price they would ultimately pay for the privilege of crossing that threshold. And his judgments, like everything else about the divine, operated by a logic that mortals could only guess at, creating stories that rewarded some people and destroyed others with no apparent pattern beyond the gods' own inscrutable preferences. Standing on the shore of Tir na Nog, looking out at the eternally perfect landscape with its jeweled fruit and its melodious streams and its inhabitants who never aged or suffered or died, you might wonder whether paradise is really all it's cracked up to be, whether the absence of struggle and loss and change is actually desirable or just sounds that way when you're mired in mortal difficulties. The Irish who told these stories seem to have understood that paradise is complicated, that getting everything you want might turn out to be its own kind of curse, that the grass is always greener on the otherworld side of the fence, but you should probably think very carefully before deciding to jump that fence because you might not be able to jump back. The mist that Manannán could summon at will, the feth fiada that concealed the Sídhe mounds and occasionally descended on mortals at inconvenient moments, represented another kind of boundary, a soft barrier that didn't prevent crossing so much as obscure the moment when crossing occurred. You could walk into that mist thinking you were still in Ireland and emerge on the other side in Mag Mell without ever being consciously aware of the transition, which is either wonderfully magical or absolutely terrifying depending on your perspective and how much you value being in control of your own location. This accidental crossing, this stumbling into the otherworld without meaning to, was a theme that appeared in many stories, suggesting that the ancient Celts believed enlightenment or transformation or contact with the divine wasn't always something you could actively seek. Sometimes it found you, sometimes you were chosen without being consulted, sometimes the veil between worlds simply thinned at the exact moment you happened to be standing in the exact place where it was thinnest, and suddenly you were having an otherworldly experience whether you were prepared for it or not. The otherworld was also, importantly, a place where the normal social hierarchies and restrictions of mortal life could be temporarily suspended, where a commoner might feast alongside gods, where women exercised power and agency that would have been denied them in ordinary Irish society, where the rules governing behaviour and possibility were different enough that anything might happen. This made it not just a religious concept but also a kind of social pressure valve, a space where the restrictions of Iron Age life could be imaginatively transcended even if they couldn't be actually overcome. The beauty of Tír na Nog and its sister realms wasn't just aesthetic, it was moral and spiritual and existential. It represented a perfection that critiqued the imperfect world of mortal experience. By describing a place where there was no sickness, no aging, no death, no scarcity, no conflict that couldn't be resolved through magic or divine intervention, the storytellers were implicitly pointing out all the ways that ordinary life fell short of what life could theoretically be, all the suffering that felt arbitrary and unnecessary, all the losses that seemed cruel and pointless. And yet, the stories also recognized that this perfection came at a cost, that living in paradise meant giving up something essential about mortality, some quality of experience that only makes sense in the context of limitation and loss and time running out. Oisín chose to leave paradise because 3 years of perfection, even 3 subjective years that were objectively 300, weren't enough to erase his need for the mortal world, for the specific place and people and time that had shaped him into who he was. The sound of the water in Manannán's fountain, more melodious than any human music, representing the 5 senses and the flow of knowledge through consciousness, was exactly the kind of perfect metaphor that Druids built entire philosophical systems around, exactly the kind of image that could inspire meditation and contemplation and lengthy discussions about the nature of reality and perception. Standing beside that fountain, listening to its song, watching the salmon crack open hazelnuts that held all the wisdom of the world, you would have received an education that no mortal school could provide, insights into the fundamental nature of existence itself. But you would also, eventually, have to leave, have to return to a world where water is just water, and fish are just fish, and wisdom has to be earned through hard experience rather than downloaded directly from magical salmon. And carrying that knowledge back with you, trying to apply otherworldly insights to mortal problems, would be its own kind of challenge, its own kind of isolation, because how do you explain to someone who's never left Ireland that you've drunk from the fountain of knowledge in Tír na Nog and nothing will ever be the same? The gifts that Manannán gave to mortals, the silver branch and the golden goblet, and the various other magical objects that appear throughout the stories, served as both blessings and burdens, tools that could improve your life but also marked you as someone who had attracted divine attention, which was always a double-edged distinction. Having Fragarac, the sword that could cut through anything and compel truth sounds amazing until you realize that everyone around you knows you possess such a weapon and will either try to steal it or try to kill you to prevent you from using it on them. And also, you can never again pretend not to know when someone is lying to you, which probably ruins most social interactions permanently. The inhabitants of the otherworld, those pale, beautiful beings with their bright eyes and their melodious voices and their incomprehensible motivations, represented everything that mortals aspired to and everything they feared: immortality and power and freedom from suffering, yes, but also a kind of inhumanity, an inability to fully comprehend or care about mortal concerns because they existed so far outside the framework that makes mortality meaningful. They could fall in love with mortals, as Niamh fell in love with Oisín, but their love operated by different rules, persisted unchanging for centuries, survived separations that would have destroyed any normal relationship, and demanded sacrifices that mortal love rarely required. The fact that Niamh couldn't or wouldn't follow Oisín when he returned to Ireland, that she gave him her horse but stayed behind in Tir na Nug, suggests the limitations of even otherworldly love, the boundaries that even gods couldn't or wouldn't cross, the ways that different kinds of beings remain fundamentally separate even when they're deeply connected. She could love him enough to let him go, love him enough to warn him about the dangers of touching Irish soil, love him enough to grieve his loss forever, but she couldn't love him enough to become mortal herself, to give up her own immortality and perfection, to be with him in the imperfect world he chose. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Celtic Otherworld. Not that paradise exists and we should strive to reach it, but that belonging always comes with limitations, that choosing one world means giving up access to another, that the boundaries between different states of being exist for reasons that transcend individual preference or desire. Oisín couldn't remain in Tir na Nug because something essential about him required mortality, required change, required connection to a specific time and place and history. Niamh couldn't follow him to Ireland because something essential about her nature was tied to the otherworld, to its timelessness and its perfection and its separation from mortal concerns. The tragedy isn't that they loved each other and were separated, tragic as that is. The tragedy is that there was no third option, no hybrid state that would have allowed them to be together without one of them sacrificing everything that made them who they were. The boundary between mortal and immortal isn't just a physical separation, it's a fundamental ontological division, a difference in the nature of being that can be temporarily bridged but never permanently overcome. And Manannán, watching all of this unfold from his palace of silver and white, surrounded by his magical possessions and his inexhaustible swine and his mist of forgetfulness, probably understood better than anyone that these tragedies were inevitable, that mortals and immortals were never meant to merge completely, that the otherworld and Ireland needed to remain separate even as they occasionally touched and influenced each other. His role as guardian of the threshold meant maintaining that separation even as he enabled selective crossing, protecting both realms from the chaos that would result if the boundary dissolved completely. The image of Tir na Nug existing somewhere beyond the western horizon, always visible but never quite reachable, always promising but never quite delivering lasting happiness to those mortals who managed to visit it, has persisted in Irish culture for millennia, evolving but never quite disappearing, surviving Christianization by being reframed and reinterpreted, inspiring poets and artists and storytellers in every generation who recognized something essential and true in the idea of a perfect realm just slightly out of reach. The white horses that could gallop across water, the silver branches that sang when shaken, the fountains that flowed with knowledge instead of just water, the halls where feasting never ended and the food never diminished. All of these images have become archetypal, part of the deep structure of Western mythology, influencing everything from Arthurian legend to modern fantasy literature, proving that the ancient Irish really understood something fundamental about the human need to imagine alternatives to the world as it is. And as you drift off tonight, Perhaps you'll dream of standing on that shore in Tir na Neg, breathing air that tastes like apples and honeysuckle and promises, listening to water that sings in harmonies too complex for ordinary music, watching the sun hang suspended in a sky that never quite turns to night, feeling the weight of eternity settle around you like a comfortable cloak, understanding that you're standing in a place where time has no power, where death has no dominion, where every moment stretches out infinitely in all directions, perfect and unchanging, and somehow, despite everything, just slightly, subtly, inevitably unsatisfying in ways you can't quite the truth about the Celtic Otherworld, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand before we go any further into its mysteries, is that it was never quite what the modern mind wants it to be. We've been trained by centuries of Christian theology to think in binary terms, heaven above and hell below, the afterlife separated from this life by the absolute wall of death. But the Celts, those ancient people who stood on the western shores of Europe watching the sun sink into the sea, they understood something more complex, more fluid, more strange. They knew that the otherworld wasn't a place you went only when you died. It was a dimension that existed right alongside the mortal realm, separated not by death, but by a veil so thin that sometimes, in certain places, at certain times, you could reach through it without even meaning to. Think of it this way, and this is admittedly an imperfect metaphor because all metaphors about the supernatural tend to be imperfect. The relationship between the mortal world and the other world was less like earth and heaven and more like two countries sharing an extremely porous border. Two territories that existed in the same physical space, occupying the same mountains and valleys and shores, but on different planes of reality, different frequencies, if you will. And at certain points along this border, at certain moments when the angle of the light was just right or when the calendar aligned in particular ways, the barrier between them would thin to almost nothing, and crossing from one to the other became not just possible but almost inevitable. The ancient Irish had a word for this boundary, this liminal membrane that kept the worlds separate while simultaneously allowing passage between them. They called it the faith fiada, which scholars usually translate as the mist of invisibility or the magic mist, though neither translation quite captures the full weight of the concept. It wasn't just a fog that made things invisible, though it certainly could do that. It was more like a glamour, an enchantment that existed in the space between perception and reality, causing each world to be hidden from the other while remaining perfectly present, perfectly real, perfectly accessible to those who knew how to look. Manannán was particularly adept at manipulating this veil, at controlling who could see what and when, at orchestrating encounters between mortals and immortals with the precision of someone conducting a symphony. After the Tuatha De Danann retreated into the Hollow Hills following their defeat by the Milesians, it was Manannán who wrapped them all in layers of Feth Fiada, ensuring that mortals could walk right past a Sídhe mound, could stand directly on top of an entrance to the otherworld, and never notice anything more unusual than a particularly verdant hill. The gods were still there, living their eternal lives, feasting and fighting and loving and creating, but they existed in a parallel version of Ireland that overlapped with the mortal realm without being visible to it. Except, of course, when they wanted to be visible, or when the natural thinning of the veil made visibility unavoidable. Because the Feth Fiada, powerful as it was, wasn't absolute, wasn't impenetrable, it had weak points, moments when it flickered and faded and allowed the two realms to touch. These weak points appeared in specific locations and at specific times, creating a network of gateways and threshold moments that the ancient Celts learned to recognize and, sometimes, to navigate. The most famous of these gateways, the most reliable portals between the worlds, were the ancient burial mounds that dotted the Irish landscape like monuments to a time before memory. The Sídhe, as they were called, were structures that predated even the Celtic peoples, massive earthworks and stone tombs built by Neolithic farmers whose names and languages and beliefs had been lost to the millennia. But the Celts recognized something profound in these monuments. understood intuitively that places where the dead had been laid to rest were inherently liminal, already existing partway between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. When the Tuatha De Danann retreated underground, they didn't build new dwellings, they moved into these ancient structures, claiming them as their own, transforming them from tombs into palaces, or perhaps revealing that they had always been palaces, that the line between a place of death and a place of eternal life was much finer than mortals imagined. The most magnificent of these mounds was Brú na Bóinne, the complex in County Meath that included the massive passage tomb known today as Newgrange, a structure so precisely engineered that on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, sunlight would penetrate through a specially designed opening and illuminate the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. This was no accident, no quirk of Neolithic architecture. It was a deliberate marker of a liminal time, a moment when the sun stood still, when the year died and was reborn, when the barrier between worlds was at its most permeable. And it was at Brú na Bóinne that the Dagda, the great father god of the Tuatha De Danann, made his dwelling, or would have made his dwelling if his son Angusug hadn't tricked him out of it with one of those linguistic gymnastics displays that the Irish gods were so fond of, asking for the dwelling for a day and a night, which in Old Irish could mean either a 24-hour period or eternal day and night, forever and always. But Brú na Bóinne was far from the only Sídhe mound that served as a gateway. There were hundreds of them scattered across Ireland, each associated with a different member of the Tuatha De Danann, each potentially accessible to mortals who stumbled across them at the right moment or with the right intention. Some of these mounds were modest, grass-covered hillocks that looked entirely natural to the untrained eye, while others were obvious constructions, stone chambers and passage graves that proclaimed their artificial origin to anyone who bothered to look. But all of them shared certain characteristics. They were older than the current age, they were associated with death and burial, and they existed in that uncertain territory between earth and sky, solid matter that seemed to gesture towards something immaterial. Approaching a Sídhe mound required a certain amount of caution, because while they could serve as portals to realms of beauty and wonder, they could just as easily trap the unwary, steal away the careless, or simply refuse to open at all, leaving the would-be visitor standing on a hill in the middle of nowhere feeling foolish and disappointed. The mounds had their own will, their own preferences, their own sense of timing, and they didn't open for just anyone. You needed the right approach, the right attitude, perhaps the right lineage or destiny, and even then there were no guarantees that the entrance you sought would appear when you needed it to appear. Stories abound of mortals who found themselves inside Sídhe mounds, sometimes by accident, sometimes by invitation, always to their great surprise. They would describe approaching what seemed to be an ordinary hill, perhaps one they passed hundreds of times before without a second thought, when suddenly a door would appear where no door had been a moment earlier, or the hill itself would split open like a mouth, revealing a passageway leading down into depths that should not have been able to exist inside such a modest mound. And these mortals, driven by curiosity or compulsion or simple inability to resist, would enter, would descend, would find themselves in halls vast beyond measure, palaces of impossible architecture illuminated by light that had no source, populated by beings whose beauty was so extreme it became almost painful to behold. Which brings us to the question of whether those who find Celtic mythology's weirdest encounters most captivating. For me, it has to be these threshold moments when someone crosses into the other world without quite meaning to, when the mundane becomes magical in the space of a single step. There's something about that instant transformation that captures the essence of how strange and uncertain reality can be. Time functioned differently inside the Sídhe mounds, and not just differently in the sense that it moved at a varying pace, though that was certainly true, but differently in the sense that it stopped functioning as a linear progression entirely. Inside the otherworld realms accessed through these mounds, you entered a state that was more like eternal present than like past, present, and future arranged in orderly sequence. Events happened, certainly, things occurred, experiences were had, but they didn't build upon each other in the way that mortal experiences did. They simply existed, each moment complete and perfect and separate from the moments that came before or after. Water was another reliable portal, another place where the boundary between worlds thinned to near transparency. Lakes and rivers and the vast expanse of the ocean had always held a sacred quality in Celtic belief. Water was transformative by nature. It moved between states, solid to liquid to vapor, and back again. It was the medium through which life itself had emerged. It covered nearly 3/4 of the planet's surface. It was, in many ways, as much a part of the otherworld as it was a part of the mortal realm. Deep pools in particular, those dark, mysterious places where the water seemed bottomless and the reflections on the surface showed you strange things you couldn't quite name. These were understood to be gateways, places where diving down might take you somewhere other than simply deeper into the same body of water. Stories tell of heroes who plunged into lakes and emerged not in water but in air, finding themselves standing in otherworldly halls, completely dry, completely disoriented, completely uncertain whether they'd been transported to another place or had somehow been inside this place all along without knowing it. The Western Sea, that vast Atlantic expanse that stretched away from Ireland's coast toward a horizon that seemed to promise something just beyond reach, was perhaps the most significant water portal of all, because beyond that horizon, somewhere in the direction the sun travelled when it sank each evening, that's where the Blessed Islands lay, the paradisiacal realms ruled by Manannán and his kin, the lands where youth never faded and sorrow never touched and every moment was perfection distilled into experience. But you couldn't simply sail west and expect to find these islands. Many had tried, many had ventured out into those unpredictable waters with navigation skills and strong boats and provisions for a long journey, only to find nothing but more ocean, more waves, more empty horizons stretching onward forever. The Blessed Islands weren't located in physical space the way ordinary islands were. They existed in that uncertain territory between geography and mythology. They were real and unreal simultaneously, accessible only to those who had been chosen, those who approached them with the proper state of mind or heart or soul, those whom the islands themselves decided to reveal themselves to. And this brings us to another category of liminal times, because if space could be liminal, so could time. There were moments in the calendar when the barrier between worlds weakened regardless of where you were standing. Samhain, the festival that marked the transition from the light half of the year to the dark half, from the season of growth to the season of decline, from summer's warmth to winter's cold, was the most famous of these threshold times, the night when the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest, when the Sídhe mounds would stand open without need for password or invitation, when spirits and gods would walk freely among mortals, when anything might happen and frequently did. On Samhain night, which fell on what we now call October 31st and November 1st, the normal rules governing interaction between realms simply didn't apply. The dead could return to visit their living relatives, bringing warnings or blessings or simply wanting to check in on how things were going. The Tuatha de Danann could emerge from their hollow hills to cause mischief or mayhem, to test mortals, to steal away those who caught their fancy, to settle old scores or start new adventures. Monsters could slip through from whatever dark corners of the other world they inhabited, creatures like Eilean Midmidna, the fire-breather who emerged from his Sídhe every Samhain to burn down the hall of the High King at Tara, at least until the hero Fionn McCumhale figured out how to defeat him. Beltane, the spring festival that marked the opposite transition, from dark half to light half, from winter's grip to summer's promise, was another thin time, though its character was different from Samhain's, less ominous, more celebratory, focused on fertility and new beginnings rather than death and endings. But it was still a time when the barriers weakened, when otherworld beings might cross over, when mortals needed to be cautious about where they walked and what they said and whom they offended, because the consequences of a Beltane transgression could last for years, could mark you as someone the otherworld had noticed, which was always a double-edged distinction. Dawn and dusk. those twice-daily moments when the world was neither fully light nor fully dark, when the sun balanced on the horizon between being present and being absent. These too were liminal times, brief windows when crossing between worlds became easier. Midnight held similar properties, that moment when one day became another, when the clock reset itself, when time seemed to hesitate before continuing its forward march. And eclipses, those rare events when the sun or moon were temporarily obscured, when the expected patterns of the cosmos were disrupted, these were profoundly liminal moments, times when even the most careful person might find themselves accidentally stepping from one realm into another. The caves that pocketed the Irish landscape, dark openings in the earth that seemed to lead down into the very bones of the world, were also understood to be potential gateways, because a cave was a wound in the surface of things, a place where the inside became outside, where the hidden became accessible. The cave of Cruachan in particular, located in County Roscommon, had a reputation that made even the bravest warriors nervous, because this cave, according to legend, was literally a mouth of hell, a gateway to the dark aspects of the otherworld, and from it would emerge, particularly at Samhain, creatures of nightmare, monsters that shouldn't exist but did, beings that brought chaos and destruction simply by existing. It's worth noting that these gateways, these portals between worlds, they weren't democratic, they didn't open for everyone equally, and crossing through them wasn't always a matter of choice. The otherworld had preferences, had favourites, had its own inscrutable criteria for who should be allowed across the threshold and who should remain firmly planted in mortal reality. Some people seemed naturally attuned to the liminal spaces. They were the ones who could see fairies when others couldn't, who could hear the music from the Sídhe mounds, who would stumble through a doorway that appeared out of nowhere and find themselves in the land of eternal youth, while their companions, walking the same path at the same time, experienced nothing more unusual than a pleasant afternoon hike. This selectivity suggests that the otherworld was conscious, in some sense that it had agency and intention, that it wasn't simply a passive location waiting to be discovered, but an active participant in the drama of existence, choosing when to reveal itself and to whom. And this consciousness, if that's what it was, seemed to value certain qualities in mortals, qualities like courage or kindness or creative ability, or simply a capacity for wonder, an openness to experiencing things beyond the rational and explicable. The deep dive into understanding the otherworld as a parallel dimension rather than an afterlife is crucial for grasping what made Celtic cosmology so different from what came after it, so resistant to being neatly categorized or simplified. The Christianization of Ireland attempted to transform the otherworld into something more familiar, more in line with Mediterranean conceptions of heaven and hell and purgatory, and in many ways it succeeded. Later folklore increasingly portrayed the fairy folk as fallen angels trapped between heaven and earth, neither good enough for paradise nor bad enough for hell, and the various otherworld realms were reinterpreted as way stations on the soul's journey to final judgment. But the older conception persisted underneath, preserved in stories and songs and the collective memory of a people who couldn't quite forget that their ancestors had believed in something stranger, more ambiguous, less morally defined. The otherworld of the ancient Celts was neither reward nor punishment. It simply was, existing alongside the mortal realm, occasionally intersecting with it, always present even when invisible, always accessible even when hidden, a testament to the idea that reality is larger and more complicated than our limited perceptions suggest. Now let's turn our attention to the three great realms that existed within or beyond or alongside the mortal world, the specific territories that the ancient Irish imagined when they thought about the otherworld, the destinations that heroes journeyed toward when beautiful women appeared with silver branches and invitations that couldn't be refused. While the broader concept of the otherworld encompassed many different locations with many different names, three in particular dominated the mythological landscape, three realms that represented different aspects of what paradise might mean, different visions of what eternal life might look like. The first, and perhaps most famous of these realms was Tir na Nug, whose name translates directly to land of youth or land of the young, and that translation tells you almost everything you need to know about its essential character. This was a place where aging simply didn't happen, where the moment you crossed its threshold, whether by boat or magical horse or some other means, your body locked into whatever state it happened to be in and remained there, unchanging, for as long as you stayed. If you were young and healthy when you arrived, you remained young and healthy. If you were in your prime, you remained in your prime. Time no longer had the power to erode your flesh or dim your eyes or slow your movements. Tir Na Nog was usually described as being located across the Western Sea, an island or series of islands that shimmered on the horizon just beyond clear sight, tantalizingly close and impossibly far simultaneously. The journey to reach it was always strange, always involved some element of magic, because you couldn't simply sail there using ordinary navigation. The realm existed in a space that was adjacent to physical geography, without being strictly part of it. The white horses that could gallop across the surface of the waves, like Enbar, Manannán's steed, these were the preferred method of transport, because they could traverse the boundary between possible and impossible with the same ease they traveled between land and sea. Once you arrived in Tir Na Na, once you passed whatever test or gateway marked the entrance to this realm, you found yourself in a landscape that seemed designed by someone who had studied earthly beauty and then enhanced it in every conceivable way. The colors were more vivid, the greens impossibly lush, the blues deeper than any earthly sky, the flowers blooming in shades that didn't have names in mortal languages. The light had that particular quality we've already discussed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, illuminating without harsh shadows, warming without burning, steady and eternal as the realm itself. The inhabitants of Tir Na Nog were the Tuatha De Danann in their most glorified form, gods and goddesses who had shed any connection to the mortal world and existed in pure divine essence. They were tall and impossibly beautiful, with features too perfect to be entirely human, skin that seemed to glow with inner light, eyes that held depths of knowledge and experience that would drive a mortal mad to fully comprehend. They wore garments that seemed woven from precious metals beaten so thin they moved like silk, cloaks of silver and mantles of gold, jewelry that was both ornament and talisman, serving aesthetic and magical purposes simultaneously. The people of Tir Na Nog spent their days, though day isn't quite the right word given how time functioned there, engaged in activities that would seem familiar to mortals, but elevated to a level that transcended mere entertainment. They hunted, but their quarries were magical creatures, stags with antlers of bronze, boars who could speak in prophecies, salmon who held all the wisdom of the world in their flesh. They held games and contests, but the stakes were different from mortal competitions. They played for knowledge, for status, for the sheer joy of excellence rather than for survival or dominance. They feasted, oh how they feasted, tables stretching to the horizon laden with foods that satisfied not just physical hunger, but spiritual hunger, existential hunger, desires you didn't know you possessed until the right dish appeared before you. The bread tasted like every warm memory of home condensed into grain and baked into perfection, the meat like the satisfaction of every accomplishment you'd ever achieved, the fruit like the first moment of every love you'd ever felt. And the drink, the mead and wine and ale that flowed from inexhaustible vessels, these weren't mere intoxicants, they were gateways to altered states of consciousness, each sip revealing new aspects of reality, new ways of perceiving existence itself. Music filled Tir Na Nog constantly, harps and pipes and voices blending into harmonies that were as much magic as melody, songs that could heal wounds, induce sleep, inspire courage, evoke any emotion the musician desired to create. The harpers of the Otherworld were renowned throughout the Celtic world. Their skill was legendary even among the legendarily skilled, and hearing them play was described as one of the supreme experiences available to any conscious being, mortal or immortal. In Tir Na Nog, there was no sickness, no disease, no deterioration of any kind. What you were when you arrived was what you remained, locked into that moment of yourself forever. There was no death from natural causes, though the myths suggest that you could still be killed through violence, though such violence seems to have been rare, possibly because the absence of scarcity and the presence of endless time removed most of the usual motivations for conflict. There was no sorrow, or at least no lasting sorrow. Pain and grief might visit, but they couldn't establish permanent residence. They would always be washed away by the next wave of joy or beauty or pleasure. It sounds perfect, doesn't it? This land where youth never fades and happiness never dims. This realm where every desire is satisfied and every moment is optimized for pleasure and wonder. And yet the story suggests that even in paradise, even in the land of eternal youth, something essential was missing, something that mortals carried in their bones and couldn't leave behind even when they crossed into immortality. Perhaps it was change itself, the knowledge that this moment would lead to another moment, and that moment would be different, would carry new possibilities and new challenges. Perhaps it was mortality itself, the understanding that time was limited and therefore precious, that each moment mattered because there were only so many moments available. The second great realm was called Mag Mell, which translates to plain of delights or plain of honey or plain of happiness, depending on which scholar you consult. And while it shared many characteristics with Tir Na Nug, it had its own distinct flavour, its own particular emphasis. Where Tir Na Nog stressed youth and eternal vitality, Mag Mell focused more on peace and contentment, on the absence of strife rather than the presence of vigour. This was a place where conflict had been not just ended, but rendered impossible, where the very concept of opposition had been dissolved, where harmony was the fundamental law of existence. Mag Mell was often described as a vast plain, hence its name, a landscape of rolling grasslands and gentle hills, dotted with groves of trees whose branches bent under the weight of fruits that never rotted, never fell, never diminished, no matter how many were picked. Rivers flowed through this plain, but these were rivers of sweet mead or wine or pure crystalline water that sang as it flowed, and drinking from them brought not intoxication but clarity, a sharpening of the senses, an enhancement of perception that made every experience more vivid, more real, more thoroughly itself. The weather in Mag Mell was always perfect, which is to say it was always exactly what the inhabitants wanted it to be at any given moment. Soft rain when rain would be beautiful, sunshine when sunshine would be warming, cool breezes to carry the scent of flowers, warm winds to dry the earth after a storm. There were no extremes, no droughts or floods or hurricanes or blizzards. Nature existed in a state of perpetual balance, perfectly calibrated to support life without threatening it. The palaces and dwellings in Mag Mell were described as being built from materials that don't exist in the mortal world, or perhaps materials that exist but have been refined beyond any earthly standard of purity, walls of white silver that gleamed but never tarnished, roofs thatched from the wings of white birds, a detail that appears repeatedly in the myths and always sounds absurd until you remember that in the other world, absurdity and beauty are the same thing, that the impossible is simply another category of experience available to those who have transcended mortal limitations. Manannán MacLear was often said to rule over Mag Mell, or at least to be its primary custodian, its guardian and administrator, the one who determined who could enter and who must remain outside. In some stories, Mag Mell and Tir Na Nag are treated as the same place, simply different names for the same island paradise, while in other accounts they're distinct realms, separate territories in the larger geography of the otherworld. This inconsistency troubled medieval monks who tried to systematize the mythology, but it probably didn't bother the original storytellers much. To them, the exact relationship between various otherworld realms was less important than the general principle that such realms existed, that there were places beyond the mortal world where life was better, richer, more deeply satisfying. One of the key features of Mag Mell, one of the elements that set it apart from other otherworld realms, was its accessibility. It appears more frequently in the myths as a destination that mortals could actually reach, could actually spend time in and then return from, whereas some of the other realms seemed more theoretical, more mythological in the sense of being locations that existed in story more than in any kind of experiential reality. Heroes like Bran McPheeball, whose voyage to Mag Mell was recorded in one of the earliest Irish Otherworld tales, would journey there, would spend what seemed like a short time exploring and feasting and learning, and would return to Ireland changed but not destroyed by the experience. Though of course the definition of not destroyed is relative, because when Bran returned from what he thought was a year in Mag Mell, he discovered that centuries had passed in Ireland, that everyone he'd ever known was long dead, that his name had become a legend, and when one of his companions jumped from the boat to touch Irish soil, that companion aged centuries in an instant, turning to dust before Bran's horrified eyes. So perhaps accessible doesn't mean safe. Perhaps it just means possible. The third great realm, and in some ways the strangest of the three, was called Tír Thuin, which translates literally to land under the wave, and unlike Tír Nanag and Mag Mell, which were usually described as being islands in or beyond the Western Sea, Tír Thuin was said to exist beneath the ocean itself, an underwater kingdom where the rules of physics that governed the surface world simply didn't apply. This was Manannán's truest domain, his most personal realm, the place where his nature as a god of the sea found its fullest expression, and reaching it required not just travelling across water, but travelling through it, diving down beneath the waves and continuing to descend until you passed through some invisible boundary and found yourself in a realm where water itself became something other than water, where you could breathe it like air, where light penetrated despite depths that should have been utterly dark. The palaces of Tír Thuin were described as being built from coral and pearl and materials dredged up from the ocean floor, but materials that had been transformed by magic or divine craftsmanship into something more magnificent than their raw components suggested. Towers of white coral that spiraled upward through the green depths, walls of mother of pearl that shimmered with all the colours the sea could hold, doorways framed in gold taken from ships that had sunk in storms, their treasure claimed by the sea god and repurposed into his dwelling. The light in Tír Thuin was different from the light in other otherworld realms. It had an aquatic quality, filtered and soft, moving in patterns that suggested currents and tides, even though the water itself didn't move the way ordinary water moved. Everything glowed with a faint phosphorescence, the walls, the inhabitants, even the water itself, as though the realm generated its own illumination from some source that had nothing to do with the sun so far above. The inhabitants of this underwater realm were as varied as the ocean itself. There were the merfolk, half-human, half-fish beings who served Manannán as subjects and advisors. There were creatures that had no clear parallel in the mortal world, beings that seemed to shift between forms, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes dissolving into the water around them, sometimes existing as nothing more than currents and eddies that somehow possessed consciousness and intention. Schools of fish swam through the halls, but these weren't ordinary fish. They were Manannán's eyes and ears, his way of monitoring everything that happened in his realm, and possibly in the mortal world's oceans as well. In Tír Thuin, sound behaved strangely. Music echoed in ways that defied acoustic logic. Conversations carried across vast distances. The constant background noise of the sea, that rushing, roaring, murmuring sound, became a kind of symphony, a soundtrack to existence that was always present, always shifting, never quite the same from one moment to the next. And the creatures who dwelt here had adapted to this acoustic environment. They communicated in songs and harmonies, their language as much musical as verbal, their every utterance a performance. The tales of Tír Thuin are fewer than the tales of the island paradises, perhaps because underwater realms are inherently harder for land-dwelling humans to imagine, or perhaps because the journeys to Tír Thuin were rarer, reserved for a very specific type of hero, someone who had earned Manannán's particular attention, someone who needed something that could only be found in the deep places, in the realm where water was law and the sea god's will was absolute. One such hero was Diarmuid, of the famous love spot, that magical mark on his forehead that made any woman who looked upon it fall instantly in love with him, which was far more curse than blessing when you really think about it, and which ultimately led to his death when he cuckolded Fionn McCoomhail and paid the price for that transgression. But before his tragic end, Diarmuid journeyed to Tír Thuin. descending through the waters of a loch, passing through layers of light and dark until he emerged in Manannán's underwater kingdom, where he was tested and judged and ultimately gifted with a magical cup that could cure any illness, a cup that saved countless lives before Diarmuid's own life ended on the slopes of Ben Bulben, killed by the same enchanted boar that had been destined to end him since the moment of his birth. The three great realms, Tir Na Nog and Mag Mell and Tir Forthuin, represented different visions of paradise, different answers to the question of what would make existence perfect. Youth and vitality, peace and harmony, mystery and transformation, each realm emphasized different values, appealed to different desires, offered different versions of what eternal life might mean. And the fact that Celtic mythology included all three, never insisting that one was superior to the others, never forcing them into a hierarchy, suggests a sophisticated understanding of human desire, a recognition that perfection means different things to different people, that paradise is subjective rather than objective. But all three realms shared certain essential characteristics. All three existed in that liminal space between geography and metaphor. All three were ruled or guided by members of the Tuatha De Danann. All three were places where time behaved strangely, where the normal rules governing mortal existence were suspended or inverted, where beauty and abundance were the default state rather than rare exceptions, and all three were ultimately inaccessible to most mortals, visible only to those who had been chosen, experienced only by those whom the otherworld itself decided to reveal itself to. Which brings us, finally and inevitably, to perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the otherworld, the element that transformed paradise into trap, that made every journey to the blessed lands a gamble with stakes higher than most travelers understood until it was too late. The flow of time in the otherworld was the greatest danger any mortal could face there, more threatening than any monster, more treacherous than any test, more capable of destroying lives than any curse or weapon. We've touched on this already, on how time moved differently in the otherworld, but now we need to explore the full implications of that difference, to understand exactly how and why temporal distortion made even the most beautiful otherworld realm a place of potential catastrophe. The basic principle was simple enough. Time in the otherworld moved at a different rate than time in the mortal world, much slower in most accounts, so that what felt like a few days in Tir Na Nog might translate to decades in Ireland. What seemed like a pleasant year might actually be 3 centuries. But calling it simple undersells how profoundly disorienting, how existentially disturbing this temporal disconnect actually was. Imagine spending what feels to you like 3 years living in paradise, 3 years that feel entirely real, where you experience every day, every moment, where you fall in love and have children and build relationships and create memories, where the continuity of your consciousness gives you every reason to believe that time is passing normally, if anything more clearly than it passed in the mortal world, because in the other world every moment is vivid, every experience sharp and detailed and fully present. 3 years, a substantial period but not an incomprehensible one, long enough to settle in, to make this strange realm feel like home, but not so long that you've forgotten what you left behind. And then you return, perhaps because of homesickness, perhaps because of some obligation or promise you made, perhaps because even in paradise there's a part of you that needs to maintain connection to the world you came from, the place that made you who you are. And you discover that 300 years have passed, that Ireland has been transformed beyond recognition, that every single person you ever knew is not just dead, but long dead, buried and forgotten, turned to bones and then to dust, that you have become a legend, a story told by grandparents to children about an ancient hero who disappeared in mysterious circumstances. The psychological weight of this discovery would be absolutely crushing, more than most minds could bear, and indeed the stories suggest that most mortals who experienced this temporal dislocation didn't survive it, didn't manage to process or integrate what had happened to them. They either turned to dust themselves the moment they touched mortal ground, aging 3 centuries in an instant and crumbling into nothing, or they simply lost their minds, unable to cope with the magnitude of the loss they'd experienced, the complete severing from everything and everyone everyone they'd ever known. Oisín's story exemplifies this tragedy better than any other, and we've already walked through the broad strokes of his tale, but it's worth dwelling on certain moments, certain details that illuminate just how cruel the temporal distortion could be. Oisín wasn't a fool. He wasn't an ignorant child who didn't understand the bargain he was making. He was a warrior and a poet, a man who had lived a full life before Neve appeared, a man who understood that magic came with prices and that otherworld gifts were never quite what they seemed. And yet when Naim invited him to Tir na Nag, when she described the wonders waiting for him there, he went without hesitation because she was beautiful beyond description and her offer was everything he'd ever wanted, and because, like most mortals confronted with the otherworld's seductions, he couldn't conceive of refusing. The 3 years he spent in Tir na Nag were, by his own account, the happiest of his existence. He married Neve, they had children together, sons and a daughter who grew up in paradise. Though how children can grow up in a place where aging doesn't happen is one of those logical contradictions the myths never bother to explain. He hunted and feasted and lived the life of an honoured guest in the realm of eternal youth, and for a while, perhaps even for most of those 3 years, he was genuinely content, genuinely at peace with his decision to stay. But slowly, gradually, homesickness began to creep in. It started as just an occasional thought about his father Fionn, wondering how the old man was doing, whether the Fianna was still keeping Ireland safe, whether his friends missed him as much as he missed them in the quiet moments between otherworld pleasures. These thoughts were easy to push aside at first, because there was always another feast, another hunt, another wonder to experience, but they persisted, grew stronger, more insistent, until finally he couldn't ignore them anymore, until the ache for Ireland, for the land and people he'd left behind, became stronger than the pleasure of paradise. Neem knew what he was feeling before he said anything, because in the otherworld emotions were transparent in ways they never were in the mortal realm, and she tried to dissuade him, not because she didn't understand his desire to return, but because she knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from being a daughter of the otherworld, exactly what would happen if he did. She warned him about the time, explained that those 3 years he'd experienced as 3 years had actually been 300, that the island he remembered no longer existed, that returning would be painful at best, fatal at worst. But Oisín couldn't quite believe her, or perhaps couldn't quite grasp the magnitude of what she was saying. 300 years was an abstraction, a number too large to feel real. He thought he understood, thought he was prepared, but understanding intellectually and understanding emotionally are two entirely different things, and no amount of warning could have prepared him for what he would actually find when he returned. Neve, because she loved him, because she couldn't bear to keep him prisoner even in paradise, gave him permission to go back, but she set one condition, one rule that seemed simple enough to follow. He could ride Enbar, the magical horse that could gallop across the surface of the sea, back to Ireland, but under no circumstances was he to dismount, under no circumstances was his foot to touch Irish soil. As long as he remained on the horse, as long as he stayed connected to that piece of the otherworld, he would remain protected, would remain the young, vital man he was, but the moment he touched the mortal earth, all those 300 years would catch up with him at once. You already know how this story ends. We've already walked through the tragedy of his fall. How he leaned down to help strangers move a stone, how his saddle broke, how he touched the ground and aged 3 centuries in seconds, how he became the oldest man anyone had ever seen, lying in the dirt too weak to stand, abandoned by Enbar who galloped back to Tir na Nag without him. But it's worth considering what that moment must have felt like from Oisín's perspective, the instant when he realised what had happened, when his body betrayed him all at once, when every year he hadn't aged in Tir na Nag came flooding back, rewriting his flesh, bending his bones, clouding his eyes, stealing his strength, turning him from a vital warrior into an ancient ruin in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And worse than the physical transformation was the knowledge that followed it. The gradual understanding that he was stranded here, stranded in a time that wasn't his, surrounded by people who were strangers, speaking a language that had shifted just enough to sound wrong, living in a world that bore little resemblance to the island he'd left behind. The forests were different, the settlements in different locations, even the shape of the coastline had changed, eroded by centuries of tides he hadn't witnessed. He was a ghost haunting his own life, or rather haunting the absence of his life, because his life was over, had been over for centuries. All that remained was this strange coda, this epilogue where he got to see how the story had continued without him. The stories tell us that St. Patrick found Oisín, that the saint sat with this ancient pagan warrior and listened to his tales, that they argued about theology, Patrick trying to convert Oisín to Christianity, Oisín stubbornly defending the old ways, the old gods, the life he'd lived before paradise claimed him. These dialogues were almost certainly invented by medieval monks, literary devices that allowed them to preserve pagan mythology while simultaneously condemning it, but there's something touching about the image regardless, the last warrior of the Fianna and the man who would transform Ireland's religious landscape, meeting at this liminal moment in history, the old world and the new world sitting beside each other in the dusk. Oisín died shortly after returning. The accounts vary on whether it took days or weeks, but everyone agrees that he didn't last long, that his body, having aged 3 centuries in an instant, simply couldn't sustain life much longer. And with his death came the death of the Fianna, the end of that legendary band of warriors who had protected Ireland in its mythological past, the final severing of the connection between the mortal world and the age when gods walked openly among humans. But Oisín's story, tragic as it is, wasn't unique. The temporal dangers of the otherworld claimed many victims over the years, many heroes and ordinary people who made the same journey, who experienced the same terrible homecoming. The story of Bran MacFeeble, who sailed to Mag Mell and returned to find centuries had passed, who watched his companion age to dust the moment his feet touched Irish sand, who decided to never come ashore at all, to remain on his boat telling his story to the people gathered on the beach before sailing away again, presumably back to the otherworld since there was nowhere else left for him to go. Or the tales from Welsh mythology about those who visited On Ren, the Welsh otherworld, and returned to find similar temporal displacements, years or decades or centuries missing from the mortal world, everything they knew transformed or destroyed by the passage of time they hadn't experienced. The story of the 7 survivors of Bendigeid Fran who feasted in the otherworld for 80 years that felt like a single evening, who were commanded not to open a certain door, who eventually opened it anyway and were instantly reminded of all the grief and loss they'd been protected from, the weight of 80 years crashing down on them all at once. In considering all this Celtic mythology's most terrifying element, which aspect do you find most unsettling? For me, it has to be the way time works as betrayal, the way paradise becomes a trap, not through any malicious intent, but simply through the nature of reality in the otherworld. There's something deeply disturbing about that. The mechanics of why time worked this way, why the otherworld operated on a different temporal frequency than the mortal realm, were never really explained in the myths. It was simply presented as a fundamental property of these spaces, as intrinsic to their nature as the eternal youth or the impossible beauty or the endless abundance. Perhaps it had something to do with the otherworld existing partially outside normal space-time, occupying a different dimension that intersected with mortal reality without being fully subject to its laws. Perhaps it was an expression of the difference between mortal and divine consciousness. Gods experienced time differently because they were eternal, and the otherworld, being the realm of gods, reflected that divine temporality. Or perhaps, and this is speculation, but speculation informed by the symbolic weight the myths seem to place on time, perhaps the temporal distortion was a necessary feature, a built-in defense mechanism that ensured the otherworld remained other, that prevented mortals from simply moving back and forth between realms at will, that maintained the separation between divine and human even when that separation was being temporarily bridged. If you could visit Tir na Nag and return to Ireland without any negative consequences, if the round trip was safe and reliable, then the otherworld would cease to be another world, it would just become another location, magical certainly, but not fundamentally different from any other place you might journey to. The temporal danger enforced the specialness, enforced the understanding that crossing into the other world was a profound act, not a casual trip, that it represented a transformation of your relationship to reality itself, not just a change in your geographic location. Every mortal who journeyed to the Blessed Lands did so knowing, or at least being warned, that they might never truly return, that even if they physically came back, they would be returning as something other than what they left, as changed not just by their experiences, but by the very act of having existed in a space where normal time didn't apply. And yet, despite all these warnings, despite all the tragic examples, despite the clear and present danger that temporal distortion represented, mortals continued to accept invitations to the other world, continued to board magical boats and mount enchanted horses, and follow beautiful women through doors that opened in hillsides. Why? Because the alternative was to live an entire life never knowing, never experiencing, never stepping beyond the boundaries that constrained every moment of mortal existence. Because the risk, however great, seemed worth taking for even a chance to touch something eternal, something perfect, something that transcended the grinding limitations of ordinary life. Because humans have always been willing to gamble everything for a taste of paradise, even when paradise comes with an expiration date written in centuries rather than years. The temporal nature of the otherworld represented one of Celtic mythology's most sophisticated insights into the nature of desire and consequence, into the ways that what we want most can destroy us, into how paradise and trap can be the same place depending on your perspective and your timing and your ability to let go of what you've left behind. It acknowledged that transcendence comes with prices, that stepping beyond normal human experience means accepting costs that might not be calculable until long after the bill comes due, a recognition that feels far more honest, far more psychologically acute than simpler myths that promise rewards without risks or punishments without complexity. The modern mind, trained to think in terms of happy endings and just desserts, struggles with the otherworld's temporal mechanics, wants them to make sense in some moral framework, wants the people who suffered temporal displacement to have somehow deserved it, to have been punished for hubris or greed or some other failing. But the myths don't support that interpretation. The people who lost centuries didn't necessarily do anything wrong. They were often heroes, good people, individuals of courage and honor. Their suffering wasn't punishment, it was simply consequence, the inevitable result of moving between realms that operated by incompatible rules. Oisín loved Neith and was loved by her in return. Their relationship wasn't transgression, it was genuine connection, deep and real, and yet it still ended in tragedy, still resulted in his destruction, because love across the boundary between mortal and immortal was inherently unstable, inherently doomed by the nature of what those words meant. He didn't fail a test, didn't break a taboo beyond the one he was explicitly warned about. He simply made the choice to return home, a choice that in any normal context would be perfectly reasonable, even admirable, but in the context of the otherworld became fatal. This lack of clear moral causation, this refusal to assign blame or justify suffering, makes the temporal dangers of the otherworld feel more real somehow, more like actual dangers rather than literary devices. Because real dangers don't care about your virtue or your intentions, they simply exist, and you either navigate them successfully or you don't. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the boundaries between this world and others are thinner than we usually acknowledge, that time is stranger than we usually admit, that reality contains more mysteries than our everyday consciousness can comfortably accommodate, and that somewhere beyond the western horizon, beyond the veil of perception that keeps the mundane separate from the magical, Tir Na Nog still exists, eternal and unchanging, waiting for those rare souls, brave enough or foolish enough to accept its invitation, to ride across the waves on a white horse, to step into a realm where 3 years might be 300, where paradise and prison are the same place, where the only thing more